The children were crying. Some were too young to understand what was happening. Others knew they might never see their parents again. Warsaw, 1942. Behind a wall 9 feet high and 12 miles long, nearly 400,000 Jewish men, women and children had been sealed inside a few square miles of city. The Nazis called it a Jewish quarter. The people trapped inside called it what it was, a slow death sentence. Typhus moved through the streets like smoke. Families of 8 or 10 were crowded into a single room with one window, one pot, and almost nothing to eat. Food rations had been cut so severely that the average ghetto inhabitant received fewer daily calories than prisoners of war were legally entitled to under international law. On the pavements, children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes buggered for scraps. Some sat down in doorways one morning and simply did not get back up. Corpses lay in the streets for hours, sometimes days. And yet in the middle of all of this, the disease, the hunger, the unbearable smell of despair, a young woman carrying a toolbox walked through the gates. She had papers. She had a reason to be there. She had a plan. Her name was Irena Sendler. And over the next 2 years, she would do something that most people at the time believed was simply impossible. She would save 2,500 children. But to understand how she did it, and what it cost her, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a small Polish town, and to a doctor who gave his daughter a lesson she carried for the rest of her life. Irena Sendler was born in 1910 in Utwok, a quiet town 15 miles southeast of Warsaw. Her father, Stanisław, was a physician, one of the very few non-Jewish doctors in the region who regularly treated Jewish patients. In an era when antisemitism was woven through Polish life as naturally as thread through cloth, that alone made him unusual. But it wasn't simply what her father did, it was something he told her directly. If you see someone drowning, he said, you must try to save them even if you cannot swim. He died of typhus in 1917 after refusing to abandon the patients who had infected him. Irena was 7 years old, but the lesson had already taken root. Some people would later say that her entire life was spent living it out. She studied at the University of Warsaw and trained as a social worker. She was known as someone who didn't just file reports, she showed up. When the university implemented its ghetto bench system, a policy that forced Jewish students to sit in segregated sections of lecture halls, Irena refused to sit in her assigned seat. She stood in solidarity with her Jewish classmates. The university suspended her for a year. Even before the war, she had demonstrated something essential about who she was. She would pay a personal price for what she believed was right. Then, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. And the world Irena Sendler had known came apart in a matter of days. By November 1940, the order had been issued. Warsaw's Jewish population, nearly a third of the entire city, was to be confined to a designated zone. The wall went up brick by brick. The gates were bolted shut. And a community of hundreds of thousands of people found themselves imprisoned, with almost no way out and no clear sense of what was waiting for them next. Irena, now working for Warsaw's social welfare department, watched it happen. She didn't look away, she found a way in. As a social worker, she obtained a pass from the Warsaw Epidemic Control Department. Sanitation officials were permitted inside the ghetto to help contain the spread of typhus and other diseases. She used that pass as her key. She began entering the ghetto regularly, almost daily. What she saw inside took something from her that she said she never recovered. She saw children, tiny, hollow-cheeked children, selling newspapers or cigarettes on the street corners, anything to earn a few coins for food. She saw mothers wrapping their infants in extra layers not for warmth, but to disguise how thin they had become. She saw a boy no older than 6 sleeping pressed against a building, his shoes worn through to bare skin. She saw a woman weeping quietly on a step, holding an infant that was no longer breathing, unable to stand up and carry it any further. She brought what she could, food, medicine, clothing, money funneled through the Polish underground resistance organization Zagata, which would eventually choose her to lead its children's bureau. But something was becoming clear to her, and it was a thought so terrible it was almost unbearable to hold. Charity would not save these children. The ghetto was not a place of hardship that could be relieved by supplies and goodwill. It was a place that had been designed deliberately and methodically to kill. The question was no longer how to make things better inside the wall. The question was how to get children out of it, and that question almost broke the people forced to ask it, because what it really meant, what it required, was for a parent to look at their child and make an impossible choice. Hand your son, your daughter, to a stranger. Watch them walk out of your sight, possibly forever. Give up the thing you love most in order to give it the only chance it has. Some parents refused. They held their children closer and shook their heads. They could not do it, and Irena never once blamed them. She understood, others said yes. And with that single, trembling yes, the real work began. The methods Irena and her network used were as daring as they were precise. Infants were the most difficult to move. A single cry at the wrong moment could end everything: the child, the rescue worker, the entire operation. Some infants were sedated lightly, carefully, with medications obtained through underground channels. They were placed inside toolboxes, potato sacks, ambulance stretchers with false bottoms. One account describes a baby being carried out in a burlap bag ordinarily used to haul garbage. The child was still. The guard at the gate did not stop to look inside. Older children were walked out through the courthouse, a building that sat directly on the ghetto wall and had entrances on both sides, one facing inward, one facing the open city. The children were coached on what to say, what name to use, how to stand, how to look calm. Many had never set foot inside a Catholic church. Irena's network arranged for them to memorize prayers, the words, the rhythm, the way to hold their hands. They had to look like they belonged in a world that had not yet tried to destroy them. Some children were led through Warsaw's underground sewer system, lowered into darkness, guided through tunnels beneath the streets. They emerged on the other side of the wall like ghosts, children who had just passed through the underworld to find a second chance at living. Each child who made it out was placed with a Polish family, a convent, a sympathetic priest, an orphanage, or an individual willing to risk everything. In Nazi-occupied Poland, hiding a Jewish person was punishable by death, not just for the person sheltering them, for their entire family. Irena knew that every person in her network was staking their life, and the lives of everyone they loved, on the hope that this child would not be discovered. And yet, person after person said yes. But something haunted Irena from the very beginning, a fear that lived alongside her courage and never left. These children were being saved with new names, new identities, new lives. They were being erased in a way that might survive beyond the war if the war ever ended. They would grow up not knowing who they were, not knowing the names of their parents, not knowing where they had come from, and so she did something remarkable. She kept records. On thin slips of paper in handwriting small enough to conceal in the folds of clothing, she wrote down every child's real name, their original name, the name of their mother and father, the street where their family had lived before the wall went up. When each slip was complete, she rolled it carefully and placed it inside a glass jar, jar after jar, filled with names, names that were the only living thread connecting rescued children to who they had once been. She buried those jars beneath an apple tree in the garden of a trusted colleague at number 9 Lekarska Street. Whatever happened to her, those names would survive. The children would one day be able to find their way back to their own history. But on the night of October 20th, 1943, the Gestapo came for her. Someone had talked. Whether from fear, desperation, or something more deliberate has never been fully established. But the Gestapo arrived at her apartment and tore it apart. They found some of her lists. They arrested her and took her to the most feared address in wartime Warsaw, Schucher Avenue, the headquarters of the Gestapo. What happened inside those walls is difficult to recount. Irena was tortured. Her interrogators broke both her legs and both her feet. They wanted names. They wanted addresses. They wanted to know who else was in the network where the children were hidden, who had given shelter, who had given money. She gave them nothing. Not one name. Not one address. Not a single piece of information that could have led her interrogators to a hidden child or an open door. She endured what was done to her and she did not speak. She was sentenced to death, but Zegota had not abandoned her. Through bribery, through carefully placed negotiations, through the kind of raw courage that ordinary people find only in the most extraordinary of circumstances, the organization managed to buy her release. On the morning of her scheduled execution, a guard who had been paid looked the other way. Irena's name was posted on the official list of executed prisoners. On paper she was dead. She spent the rest of the war in hiding, living under a false name, still working where she could, still trying. When the war finally ended in 1945, Irena returned to that apple tree. She dug up the jars. She began the slow, heartbreaking work of trying to reunite children with their families, and discovered case after case that there was no family left to find. Most of the parents who had handed their children to strangers at the ghetto gate had been sent to Treblinka. Most had not come back. The jars were full of names orphaned twice, once by the war and once by its ending. For decades, Irena's story remained largely buried. In post-war Poland, under communist rule, speaking openly about wartime resistance networks was politically sensitive, often unwelcome. She lived quietly, her extraordinary history known only to those who had shared it with her. Then, in 1999, a group of high school students in a small town in Kansas came across a brief mention of her name in a magazine article. It was barely a footnote. A Polish social worker who had reportedly saved 2,500 Jewish children during the Holocaust. The students assumed she had died long ago. They decided to write a short play honoring her memory. They were wrong about one thing: Irena Sendler was alive. She was 90 years old, living in a Warsaw nursing home, when she learned that teenagers in rural America had written a play about her life and were performing it across the country. The students traveled to Poland to meet her. What they found was a small, frail woman who wept when she saw them, not because of the recognition, but because after all those years she had never stopped grieving for the children she hadn't been able to save. "I could have done more," she told them simply. "This regret will follow me to my death." In 2007, the Polish parliament nominated Irena Sendler for the Nobel Peace Prize. She did not receive it. The decision drew quiet controversy, not because that year's recipient was undeserving, but because those who knew Irena's story found it almost impossible to accept that what she had done had not been enough. She died on May 12, 2008, at the age of 98. She was buried in Warsaw, in a city that had once posted her name on a list of the executed. Today, schools bear her name in Poland, in Israel, and in the United States. The children she rescued, or rather their children and their grandchildren, live across the world. In Tel Aviv and New York, in London and Toronto and Melbourne. Some grew up knowing the full story of what had been done for them. Others only learned as adults that the name they had been born with had once been written on a thin slip of paper, rolled tightly, and sealed inside a glass jar beneath an apple tree, placed there by a woman who had decided that no child's name would be erased on her watch. Irena Sendler never thought of herself as a hero. She found the word uncomfortable, almost offensive. She believed that she had simply done what any decent human being would do when confronted with suffering they had the power to ease. But that is perhaps the most remarkable thing about her story. Because most people, when faced with that level of risk, when they could feel the cold weight of what it meant to get caught, when they understood with complete clarity that one wrong step meant death for themselves, and everyone they loved, most people stepped back. She stepped forward. And 2,500 children grew up to have children of their own, because one woman with a toolbox, a handful of glass jars, and an unshakable sense of what it meant to be a human being decided that a child's life was worth more than her own safety. The wall came down. The jars came up. And the names inside them, those fragile, handwritten names, turned out to be more permanent than the regime that had tried to erase them.